Before we do anything else, I want you to listen to something. This is a recording from the year 1939. It's by an Armenian American named Hovsep Bedrosian, and he was living in Central California during the Great Depression. I think some of you are going to recognize this melody. Yes, indeed, that was Yankee Doodle, but it sounds a little bit different than when I had to learn it as an elementary school student, learning about the American Revolution. To some of you, it probably sounds a little bit out of tune, and some of you might have had a reaction to that very bright, harsh timbre. But what I want to suggest to you in this talk is that immigrant recordings like this can actually tell us quite a lot about our history, and specifically about the history behind concepts that we still struggle with today. These are concepts like race, diversity, belonging. But these recordings can only tell us about these concepts if we cultivate a specific way of listening. And this is a way of listening that moves beyond the evaluative, do I like this music, do I not like this music, and moves toward asking questions. Questions about the people who made this music, what was important to them, and what their lives were like. So let me introduce you to Fresno, California. This is where my great-grandparents settled in 1936. And one of the things that my great-grandmother, who was an ethnic German from the Russian Empire, one of the things that she noticed was this area's diversity. She liked the hats that Japanese farmers wore, and she also raved about the produce brought by immigrants from the Mediterranean and the Middle East. She loved the figs, the nuts, the apricots, the olives. She said she couldn't get enough of them. Well, my great-grandmother was not the only person to notice Central California's quite remarkable ethnic diversity. There was a researcher, an ethnomusicologist named Sidney Robertson Cowell, who got a grant from the federal government, from the Works Progress Administration, to conduct field research up and down the state. And it was Sidney Robertson Cowell who recorded my absolute favorite rendition of Yankee Doodle. Before I get too far into this, I have to thank Catherine Hebert-Kirst, who is the person who inspired me to work with this collection and whose research has very much influenced the way I interpret these materials. So let's listen to this recording again, and what I'd like you to do is think of what kinds of questions this might inspire. All right, so since this is a talk and not a class discussion, I get to tell you what my questions are. And so some of the questions that I would ask about this are, first, why does this sound out of tune to me? Does it sound out of tune to everybody? So one thing we know is that there are a number of different tuning systems around the world. Hovsep Bedrosian is from a region called Kharpert. This was part of the Ottoman Empire. He was born as an Armenian in the Ottoman Empire, which meant he was a Christian minority in these kind of eastern reaches of the empire. And this is an area where there are numerous types of tuning systems. And so it's quite likely that the notes he was playing in this recording would have sounded entirely appropriate in this part of the world. Whether you were Armenian, whether you were Turkish, whether you were Kurdish, whether you were part of any of those ethnic groups that made up the Ottoman Empire. But we can start to think of this as some kind of a sonic combination between the Ottoman Empire and Fresno, California. But Sidney Robertson Cowell actually wants to go farther than this. She wants to know, what do people in Fresno think about this? Do people like this song? And she finds out that, sure enough, it was much in demand at Armenian picnics. But she also talks to someone who absolutely detested it. This is a man who thought that Armenian music should not sound like it comes from the Ottoman Empire. This is someone to whom true Armenian music sounded much more like the music you would hear in Western Europe. And it's important to remember that at this time period, Armenians are facing rising violence, especially in these eastern regions of the empire. So it makes a lot of sense that some people would want to distance themselves, both geographically and culturally, from the sounds of the Ottoman Empire. So this brings me to takeaway number one, which is that when we talk about diversity, we're talking not only about diversity between cultural groups, but also about diversity within them. Concepts like what it means to be American, what it means to be Armenian, are absolutely in flux during this period. And I think today we can also relate to the instability of these kinds of identity categories. The second question I would ask about this piece is about the instrument itself. So, what is this instrument? What does it take to play it? So this is called a zurna. You'll find this across the Middle East and parts of Eastern Europe, and it is known for its loud, bright, harsh sound quality. This is an instrument that is meant to be played outdoors with no amplification. But there's a part of it that's actually quite delicate, and those are the reeds. So sound on this instrument is produced by air moving very, very quickly through two thinly sliced pieces of reed. And these are going to wear out very quickly. So you have to replenish them every once in a while. As an immigrant, that's hard to do. Who is going to be making your reeds? Well, it turns out that there is a Chinese instrument, a very similar construction. And so Hovset Bedrosian gets his reeds in Chinatown for 95 cents a box. Now, I really wonder about this. How did he know that the type of reeds he needed for his Middle Eastern zurna were available to him in Chinatown? And this is a little bit speculation here, but I think that one potential answer comes from a map. So if you've seen a map like this before, you know this is a map of real estate redlining. On this map, people are marking the undesirable neighborhoods in red, really in pink, and the most desirable neighborhoods are in blue and green. Now, across the United States, minorities were routinely denied mortgages to buy properties in those blue and green areas. And in places like Fresno, we are also seeing racially restrictive housing covenants. So things that say you cannot sell this house to people who are Black, to people who are Chinese, to people who are Armenian. And that diagonal line that cuts through the city, that's the railroad. This is a railroad that was built largely with Chinese immigrant labor. But when Chinese people wanted to settle in the city, they were relegated through these racially restrictive housing practices, quite literally, to the other side of the tracks. A few decades later, Little Armenia would join Chinatown on the industrial side of the city through much of those same practices. So this brings me to takeaway number two, which is that it's easy to hear immigrant recordings as kind of two-way cultural communication, the old country and the new. But this recording is facilitated by a much more multicultural kind of interaction. And this Chinese-Armenian communication is facilitated by racially restrictive housing practices and systems of prejudice and segregation that run through the entire map of the city. So that's the city. What about the agricultural areas that surround Fresno? This is my great-grandfather. And when he came to the Fresno area, he got a job on an Armenian-owned farm. Now, land ownership was a big deal. And we even have a song about it. This is sung by Armenian singer Ruben Baboyan. Take a listen. So one question I could ask about this is, well, what did it take to own 100 acres outside of Fresno? Well, according to the California Alien Land Law of 1913, if you wanted to own agricultural land, you had to be a US citizen. So if you were Armenian and you were born in the United States, assuming you had the money, you could own agricultural land. But if you were born outside of the US, if you were an immigrant, you were not able to under this law. And that's because naturalization, or the process of going from an immigrant to a citizen, was something that was restricted to free white persons. So that becomes very complicated and very confusing in the Armenian case. Most of the Armenians of Fresno came from that very nebulous boundary between Europe and Asia. So were they white or were they Asian? This is a period of history where you see a number of court cases, people of different immigrant groups trying to advocate for why the US government should see them as white, because whiteness comes with tangible benefits, the ability to become a citizen, the ability to own land in certain states. And so it's 1925 when the US government decides that Armenians are white. And this substantially increases a number of people's chances of owning 100 acres outside of Fresno. But the reality on the ground is quite different. Armenians in Fresno in 1939, that's almost 15 years after Cartosian, Armenians are still facing racially restrictive housing practices and other forms of prejudice in Fresno. They are playing instruments like the zurna that sound much more similar to their Chinese neighbors than to Fresno's Anglo elite further north. So this brings me to my third and last takeaway, which is that whiteness in the United States is a very arbitrary concept. It is something that has been argued, it is something that has changed, and it is something that ultimately tells us very little about what people's lives were like. At the same time, it is a powerful category because it comes with tangible benefits, the ability to become a citizen, the ability to own land. This past summer, I took a group of students to Dearborn, Michigan, and one of the people we met with was a young Arab American woman who was working to change the census categories, the racial categories on the US Census. Currently, if you are of Middle Eastern or North African descent, the box you check on the census is white. And so this woman we met with said that leaves us with insufficient data about the types of prejudice that Middle Easterners still face in the United States. And she said she understood why people like her grandfather and her great-grandfather advocated to be seen as white, but that times are different now. And the other side of this is that if we're going to be reckoning with the racial categories we have today, it is helpful to know something about the people whose lives shaped them in history. So this is what I think these types of immigrant recordings can teach us. They remind us that the people who shaped our history were real people who lived full and interesting lives. They went to picnics, they played Yankee Doodle, they went shopping in Chinatown, they argued about what music they liked, and they complained about their love lives. And they did all of this in an environment that was shaped through racial prejudice and segregation. I have a couple of very quick caveats. The first is that when we listen to the sounds of the past, it is also helpful to try to listen for the silences. Whose voices do we have access to, and whose voices are missing, and why? The second caveat is that archives are always mediated. So Sydney Robertson Cowell was an excellent researcher. She was respectful, she was detailed, and at the end of the day, her choices about what to include and what to exclude still profoundly shape the conclusions we're able to draw from this material. Nevertheless, these types of immigrant recordings, if we choose to listen to them, can teach us quite a lot about how we arrived to where we are today. So listen generously, turn your observations into questions, and follow those questions wherever they lead you. And that is one of the ways that we can then start practicing habits of listening across difference, whether that difference is a history of 100 years or some other boundary in the present day. Thank you very much.